The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Hello, and let's just go ahead and get the cheesiness out of the way. Good day. We're going to end that there. You'll understand more here in a few seconds. Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. Dave, your host and author. Thank you so much for listening. This is going to be part one of 2 episodes that we have coming up about Bay 13 Brewing, which is kind of interesting being what it is and where it is. But before we get into all of that, you know exactly where you should be, which is on our socials. At Florida Beer Blog on Instagram and Twitter. FL Beer Blog is Facebook. On the web at FloridaBeerBlog.com, FloridaBeerPodcast.com. And you'll see that it's also a proud member of the Florida Podcast Network, which you can find at FloridaPodcastNetwork.com, and follow and listen to all your new favorite Florida-based podcasts. Yay. So Bay 13 is an Australian brew pub in the heart of Coral Gables, just off of Alhambra. There's a lot going on. So yes, a Spanish styled area in a very tropical city is host to an Australian brew pub. It works. I don't know how I can say it works, but it definitely works. And for Australia Day, which was at the end of January, they actually celebrated Australia Day with their first ever Woop Woop Beer Festival. It was amazing. All sorts of brewers from around the state were able to come down. The VIPs had a lot of fantastic food. I know that there was also food for sale. Pretty sure that, who was it? Stormhouse had to have one of the mince pies, but obviously I was there for the beer. And before the event got started, in fact, all the hustle and bustle was going on behind us, I managed to sit down with Greg Berbusse. He is the head brewer at Bay 13, recently moving to Florida, coming to us from the wilds, that is Little Rock, Arkansas, to brew a very wide variety of Australian and American beers. Some Germans, some Belgians, all sorts of fun stuff thrown in there. And I didn't totally understand what an Australian beer was, or kind of a Pacific beer was. There are very distinct characteristics to those. Please try to get that blue oil can beer out of your head. I know that's where you're going. That's why I did the cheesy fake Australian stuff earlier. But let's actually get the full rundown. So we're going to talk to Greg Berbusse about his background coming to Miami and how all sorts of cultures are colliding to very great effect. Pop open a beer, enjoy, and enjoy. So I guess to start off with, if you could conceptualize Bay 13 in one sentence, what would that sentence be?
So the one sentence to kind of conceptualize Bay 13 would just be kind of a more elevated approach to an Aussie brew pub with a little heightened emphasis on Australian hospitality. So trying to pay a little bit more attention to the details as far as, keeping it clean and making sure that everyone actually enjoys everything that they have. So like not just casually walking past and just, that's more than a sentence, but not just casually walking past, like everything good, cool. Just like actually trying to connect with someone and like form a relationship.
Awesome. But obviously, as anybody who's listening can tell, you are clearly not Australian.
Right.
You're from Arkansas, as your cell phone area code would kind of dictate. So I guess starting in Arkansas, what got you into craft beer? How were you interested in pursuing this?
So I started home brewing like 36, so I doing quick math, so it's league 12 years ago. And then from there, just kind of, brewing with a buddy. We thought we were going to save money on beer, never actually did. And then started building my own equipment, writing recipes, joined a homebrew club, entered competitions, and then thought, the whole time going to school, like undergrad biology, did a master's degree, and then just thinking, like, I'd like to open a brew pub one day. Got a part-time job at a 7-barrel brew pub in Little Rock, Arkansas, where I did that a little bit for about 6 months. And then some friends at a larger production brewery, they convinced their boss to hire a third. And so they called me, and I dropped out of a PhD program and went to work there full-time. So, very, very proud parents right there.
Hey, congrats for dropping out of a PhD program. I'm right there with you.
Oh, yeah, it's the best decision.
But I do want to pause for a second. It's interesting because obviously all the professional brewers that I speak to, they start by home brewing, but they usually come from an engineering background, a teaching background, a military background. But you've got a couple of people that are like yourselves that have advanced degrees in things like biology and chemistry. Do you think that background gave you an additional little leg up when it came to understanding the science of beer?
Bit of yes and no, maybe. I mean, yes, no, and maybe. So the whole time, like working in a lab or going to class for lab, and then especially, spending most of my time in a research lab. You write down everything that you do, and if something doesn't work out, you look back at your notes and you change one thing, do it again, and you keep doing that until you get it right. And so that's kind of the approach that I took with brewing, with a lot of things, is just like tweaking one thing and just like keep doing it until get close to what I think I want in my head. So I think that kind of approach is kind of what helps me with brewing, and that's probably what helps a lot of the other brewers that maybe they started as a home brewer, maybe they didn't. If they have like an advanced degree, like science, math, whatever, like engineering, whatever, like you have to be very meticulous in those. So I think that translates very well, especially to like a larger production brewery too. So,
and it seems like the science is incredibly important because so many people that I've spoken to, the beer is good, but if you don't do things like sanitize, you're basically dead in the water.
Yeah, and so we look at everything. Like we check our water every 2 weeks, or if we turn over our hot water tank that we use for brewing and cleaning, if we turn that over faster, we'll check it a little more frequently. See, pH, dissolved solids, like whatever's in there, all the like calcium, magnesium, everything. We'll check it all, so we know what our base water is for starting, so we can build from there. And then with the other ingredients, it's proper handling. Rotating when you get new stock in, so like regular kitchen type work, and then just kind of following along with, how's the barley yield this year? How's the hop yield this year? Since we're Australian, we do get a lot of our hops from Australia for our beers. So a few years ago, the issue was, and now we're kind of seeing that with all the wildfires in the Northwest, a lot of the hops kind of have like a smoky smell to them. So how is that going to affect the beer? So
interesting.
Yeah.
And going forward, just a little bit, I promise you we're going to get back to Little Rock in just 1 second, but because I know that you do a lot of tours of the brew system, are people amazed by exactly how important a lot of those issues are when it comes to brewing beer, when it comes to not just supply lines, but also cleanliness, microbial health, things of that nature?
They are when you first talk to them, but once you kind of explain, like, at the end of the day, my job is to be a glorified janitor and clean and sanitize everything as best as possible so that the one microorganism I want to grow inside of the sugar liquid the malta that I just made will actually grow instead of something else. And then if something were to happen, which I'm lucky so far,
knocking on wood
there, can take steps to either mitigate or keep that from happening again and just kind of move on from there. So
Gotcha. So you're doing professional work. You are in Arkansas. Arkansas is a bit of a drive to Coral Gables.
Yeah.
What brought you here?
This job specifically. So,
really?
Yeah. So I was. It was a weird point where like I'd been at the brewery that I was working at for about 2 years. It's kind of a good opportunity, professionally and personally, in my life to just kind of expand horizons. So I was just applying everywhere, and I saw the ad for here. It was like it seems like too good to be true. It's like, oh, I might have a better chance winning the lottery. It's like come down to Miami, brew craft beer. and then live in Miami, and like you can write all the recipes or whatever, can have free reign. So like everything that I always wanted to do.
And that's amazing that you were given free reign. Is any input, any notes brought your way from ownership?
So the first notes I got whenever like writing some recipes and like sending them over to the owners, because half the ownership is here, half the ownership is still in Australia, and so communicating with them through Zoom until I actually got to sit with them face to face, looking over the recipes. It was just kind of, we thought you were going to use a little bit more Australian hops, and so kind of comments like that, or just when they actually came here. Kind of a funny story. We had one of our staples called Arvo. I had listed as a Pacific Ale, and then when the Australians got here, they got excited because they don't see that really outside of Australia, and so they ordered it. And what came out was apparently not a Pacific Ale, but it was just a regular Australian Pale Ale.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so there's like, it's good, but it's wrong.
Interesting. Well, I was actually going to say, because you have 3 very specific, very distinct forces when it comes to the craft beer that you make here at Bay 13 that you kind of have to juggle. And the first one is Australian beer. Obviously, most people, if I say Australian beer, they're going to think of a big blue can that has absolutely nothing to do with Australian beer. What is the Australian beer scene kind of like? What is a Pacific Ale specifically for people that want to brew it?
So the closest thing that people would recognize if they haven't heard of a Pacific Ale before reads a little bit more like a kind of similar to a hazy IPA. So there's a lot of wheat in there. It's very hazy, and then it's really hop forward with a huge late addition of Galaxy hops, and that's pretty much it. So it's real light, easy drinking.
Specifically Galaxy?
Not necessarily. That was what they told me to use, and because so Rich, I feel real bad now. I'm blanking on his last name, but he's the head brewer at Bent Spoke Brewing in Australia. He came out, and we did a brew with him, and that was a great day. And he kind of told us how he would do Pacific Ale, and so we wrote that down, and then we did that very quickly after that.
Gotcha.
So.
Interesting. And so, in terms of styles, do you try to really bring a lot of what you had heard from them and what the ownership over in Australia kind of tends to like, and have that do a little bit of dictating on what you want to focus on in the near future for your menu, for your beer menu?
A little bit. So I spent a week out there shortly after I got to Miami. They flew me out there to meet the rest of the owners, and then actually go to Australian breweries and Australian pubs to meet and see kind of what it was like out there. And so, as far as the styles that we brew here or whatever we do, like, we'll look at what's popular in Australia, like what styles, and then see if there's something that we're missing. But for the most part, their trends pretty much follow ours.
I was going to ask, because the other one, I guess the next train that you got to take a look at is good old-fashioned standard American craft beer trends.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of similarities? Are there a lot of significant differences?
What I remember from going out there and spending a week going around and meeting some really great people and having some really great beer, IPAs really hop forward, really good, clean, crisp lagers, a few stouts, a few extra pale ales, some hazies, sours, fruited stuff. So everything that we're doing here in America, craft beer wise, they're doing in Australia as well. It's just every now and then you'll run into a place that has decided, I'm only going to focus really hard on this one thing.
Yeah.
And so we went somewhere that his main focus was he put everything in a barrel, kind of like what Odd Breed is doing.
Okay.
And so he's barrel aging and trying like green coffee and barrel aging with that, and doing different types of beers in different barrels and filtering them through and stuff. So he's playing with some crazy stuff. And then down the road you'll go to another brewery, and it'll be kind of maybe the size of like Winwood Brewing out there, and then huge tap wall, large selection, great time to sit around and hang out, that sort of thing. So.
Awesome. Is Australian beer as adjunct heavy as some American craft brewers tend to be? Do they have they have the stouts where it's like, let's grab every ice cream topping that we can?
Yeah, I'm sure there's some out there doing that, but from my experience when I, going out there and tasting and then talking to the other Aussie craft brewers and the other owners was, they just wanted to see like a few sours, fruited sours every now and then. But as far as like an adjunct heavy stout or anything like that, kind of leave it open for me to decide what we want to do, when we want to do it, and then we just kind of go from there.
Awesome. But you also have the third sort of factor, which is Miami.
Yeah.
And Miami is a very different beast when it comes to alcohol completely.
Yeah.
What was that experience like when you first touched down in Miami, first got the job? Okay, I'm going to be living here. Let's see what's going on.
So the scene down here, everything starts way later, right? And so in Arkansas, 9 o'clock, 9:30, most people are ready to go home because it's dark and it gets cold half the year.
That's when some people are just getting started.
And so that was a bit of a culture shock. And then it seemed to be that everyone down here was just really gung-ho about experimenting with different adjuncts, different fruits and everything. Everything was really hop forward, or it was just a really solid lager. You know, something that they put a lot of time and effort in. So it's like, all right, we got some stuff up my alley. We'll do that.
So how do you build a tap list? And I'm looking at your wall, and it's a very significant tap list where you manage to make all three of those reasonably happy.
So we're not exactly aiming to make people like super happy or anything like that. At the end of the day, my assistant and I were brewing beers that we want to drink or we think would be fun to drink. So that's our staples list reflect beers that we think, you know, the general public would really enjoy, and it's beers that at the end of a really long day we want to have a couple of before we go home. So, you know, we always have a Pilsner on, we have a Hefeweizen on, a West Coast IPA, an Australian Pale Ale, Blonde Ale, that sort of thing. And then everything else is just rotators. And so a lot of people like to associate Australian beer with that blue lager can.
Yep.
So we try to have a bunch of different lagers on at all times. I think we have like 4 or 5 right now, maybe 6, if I remember correctly.
Gotcha.
And then from there, beyond that, I really like Belgian beer, so we work those in whenever we want, and then we just kind of sit and talk about what we think would be cool to make.
Gotcha. And I was going to say, it's not overly cheesy and touristy when it comes to the names and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Is it easy to not go down that rabbit hole, or is that
It's
something-
actually really hard not to be cheesy, and like it's really hard not to name everything like you're working at Outback Steakhouse if Outback Steakhouse had a brewery.
Which is funny because they're from Tampa.
Yeah, I know. I knew. Yeah, I thought that was funny when I moved here too. But yeah, so like most of our beers, like Merv, our house pilsner, that's named for a really famous Aussie cricket player. You know, so cricket is kind of an all-day game. So you want something light and crisp, easy to drink while you're there.
Okay.
So that's where that one came from. Arvo, or Aussie Pale Ale, that's just Aussie slang for afternoon. So have an Arvo this afternoon. And then for whatever reason, with all the IPAs that we do, so like every time we do a new one, we settled on surfing terms really early on with that.
Okay, that makes
And
sense.
so every new hazy IPA that we do, it's a new surfing term. So eventually I'll run out of lists, names for that, but not yet.
Gotcha. Nice. And obviously one of the other things that I thought was interesting about Bay 13 is, and if you take a look at the materials, the marketing materials and so on, how closely the beer side works with the kitchen. How does that conversation get started? Do you generally, because obviously it's going to take you longer to produce a beer than it is for them to produce a plate.
Yeah.
And so how far in advance do you communicate with the chef here how much conversation gets started?
I let them know pretty early on, like, hey, we're brewing these 6 beers coming up, and then I don't really say anything to them until the beer is ready, because they don't really need to know about it until the beer is ready to be pushed over into a serving tank or packed, because you can't really do anything with it. Or you could do something with the wort, but it's more fun to do it with the beer. Mm-hmm. And so it's just kind of communicating, like, hey, we have this new thing. We do a beer pair dinner twice a month. So
nice.
Twice a month we'll sit down and, pick 4 beers and then talk about different food, like dishes or proteins that, whatever to go with it, and then just kind of work that way.
Awesome.
And then as far as using beer in our food, every now and then I'll kind of walk back there and annoy them and be like, why aren't we using more beer in the food? And then they'll point out everywhere where the beer is being used. I'm like, cool, but those two don't have beer in it.
Okay, hey, that works.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned this a little bit, and I'd like to go back to it in terms of using Australian ingredients. Obviously, it's a big hop growing region.
Yeah.
With them, for the most part, Australian hops, what kind of profiles do you generally get from those? And I know that you mentioned the wildfires coming up, so obviously we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But in general, Australian hops, what do those tend to really serve? What kind of styles do those tend to serve pretty well?
They do. So there's a lot of really good hops built for just bittering purposes. So to counter the sweetness from the wort. And then Galaxy's a good dual purpose one, so bittering and using a late addition or dry hopping, so really citrus forward and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then some of the other ones that we use really regularly, we've noticed kind of more of a tropical fruit flavor and aroma, kind of more little bit sweeter fruit aroma, and then some citrus too, lemon, lime zest, marmalade.
Because I was going to say, especially with the grapes, especially over in New Zealand, which is very, very close by, those tend to have that sort of tropical fruit. If you take a look at the wines for the area, especially, Sauvignon Blanc, it's very, very papaya guava sort of mango-y flavor. Do you get a lot of those in Australian hops as well?
Yeah, so a lot of them, they'll say citrus, but really citrus is like maybe the fifth thing that you'll notice in there. It's very mango, tropical fruit, passion fruit, sweet, juicy fruits, like that sort of thing. So,
but you also mentioned that with the wildfires that had been going on in Australia, they're coming over with a little bit of a smoky character to it.
Yeah, I didn't personally have an issue with that, but which lucky again, so that's great. But a few people I talked to had kind of noticed, the year after, those hops, they had a bit of a smoked smell to it, but we ran it through and brewed it, and it was just, it went away after the brew day. So, that was fortunate, but still something to consider and think about just in case. But so far, we've been lucky.
That's kind of amazing. And as we sit here next to the system, it seems like you have managed to eke out as much space as you can vertically as you can physically. Kind of what are we looking at right now?
All right, so I'm standing in front of our double stack serving tanks. We have a 20 barrel serving tank as well. So we have 13 beers that we serve straight from the tank to the tap, and then we have 8 draft lines that run from the back. So I think right now we're running 17 beers off our own taps that we make in-house, and then we've got 5 10-barrel fermenters, and then another 20-barrel fermenter on the other side by the brew equipment.
How difficult is it to keep the tap lines full? Do you go through a lot of product on a regular basis?
During the summer, when it slows down, it's not hard. It's annoyingly easy. And then when it kind of picks up towards the end of the year, and this time of the year too, it can get a little difficult. We're in an interesting spot where we have 4 tanks that look like they're about to empty out right now, and I have malt to brew 1 beer. But
nice.
We had a pallet of malt dropped off last night, which was nice, but kind of inconvenient. But so I'll deal with that later.
I understand the feeling. So it seems like in the past couple of years that Bay 13 has been open, you've gotten it pretty dialed in to where things are pretty well solidified. Do you know if there's going to be any sort of continued growth or really trying to push your patrons and what they are interested in drinking, or are we kind of good for a little while?
Yeah, so our staples we're always looking at and evaluating and trying to see, could we do something better on brew day? Like maybe, a higher temperature for the strike water, a lower temperature for the strike water. If we do this type of malt instead of this type of malt, maybe switch up what hops we add and when. So we're always looking at that, and then also the water profile too. Because that changes pretty much every time the tank turns over. So we have to look at that and treat that as an ingredient too. As far as all the one-offs that we do, this year we're looking forward to brewing a Doppelbock at some point, trying out a bunch of different lager. I think last year we did 4 or 5 hazy IPAs, each one different. So we're going to try and do that again this year. A few more collabs this year would be great. And then, I really like Belgian beers, so I'm going to annoy everybody with some Belgian beer every now and then too.
Brew a nice quad for me.
All right.
Thank you.
I'm in.
All right. So that is part 1 of our interview with Bay 13 Brewing, actually at Woop Woop Beer Fest. The second part is we're actually going to be talking to some of the other brewers that were at the beer festival. There's a lot of great stuff which is going on there. A lot of fantastic beers from a lot of fantastic breweries, a few that I did not expect to see there. And we're going to give you a little rundown of everybody that was there because I was there with my recording equipment. Plus, there's kind of a special interview at the end of that episode that I cannot wait for you all to listen to. And I would love for you to go ahead right now and like us and subscribe to us on the podcasting app of your choice so that way you are notified the moment that episode gets released. And make sure to give us a nice juicy 5-star rating if you could as well. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Field producer is Steve Pekala, and executive producer for the Florida Podcast Network and Grand High Poobah is Jemmy Legagneur. This is Dave, your host and author. I gotta run, but we will see you next week. Drink Florida Craft.